from lunch. My name is Liliana. I'm the Executive Director at the Utah Coalition Against Sexual Assault, or UCASA. Some of you may have already seen this presentation and know the importance of serving incarcerated survivors and that work for our organization. If you're not familiar with our organization, we are the coalition that's federally assigned here in Utah as the Sexual Assault Coalition. And, you know, our vision is really that we advance a society not only in which sexual violence isn't tolerated, but I like to push it a little further now and think about what would it be for us to live in a state where violence doesn't exist, not just not tolerated. So throughout today's training, I'll go over a little bit of what the basics of detention, what it looks like here in the States, and also what are some of the concerns and challenges that we may face as victim advocates or as organizations who are interested in serving sexual assault victims who are incarcerated. And really have an overview that serving incarcerated survivors fits into the overall movement to end violence. And so as we talk about and hear stories and quotes and learn more about this work around serving incarcerated survivors, self-care is critical. So please make sure that if you need to step away, if you need to take a break, do so throughout the presentation. Now, as we begin, I think we have to have this base understanding of what PREA is, but again, it stands for the Prison Rape Elimination Act. And when PREA was introduced many years ago, it was introduced as the Prison Reduction Act. And so when that happened, Congress said, we don't just want to reduce the rapes that are happening right in our facilities, we want to eliminate them. So it turned into the Prison Rape Elimination Act, which was again introduced in 2003, and it was a unanimous vote, bipartisan support, that we need to ensure that when the state or have custody of any individual, it's their responsibility to make sure that they're safe and that they're preventing sexual violence. So the Prison Rape Elimination Act is set to prevent, detect, and respond to sexual violence within these facilities. And each facility in states differ from who's in control, but state facilities, the responsibility is of the governor. So the governor's office is responsible for the state facilities, and then jails and lockup facilities are based on county, city, and so forth. So PREA in Utah. So when this came about, that was in 2003. States had the opportunity to come to compliance and say, here are a set of standards that you have to adhere to in order to be PREA compliant. And so they worked on it. Then a lot of advocates worked on ensuring that audits were happening and that there was some level of overview or oversight that folks were following the standards. Now, what happened in this process is that Utah was one of the states that chose to not be in compliance with these standards. And so these federal standards, really help guide, obviously, the work around sexual assault in prisons, but Utah chose not to. What that means is that they lose out on federal funds for their facilities, and they opt out of audits. And so Utah has never gone through an audit from the feds to come see how they're being compliant with the PREA standards. Utah was one of two states remaining that are not in compliance with the standards. Now, when we started talking, myself and Representative Romero and Rape Recovery Center, we really wanted to address this gap and this need to respond to sexual assault victims in incarcerated settings. So PREA not only supports those that have experienced sexual violence within detention, but maybe came into detention with past trauma, that they too can get some support. So we worked on HB 95 that emphasizes really one of the standards, which is 115.53, that an inmate or resident has to have access to outside confidential support services. And so one thing we need to know about the standards too is that every state is different. And so maybe there isn't a community-based victim advocate. So it was pretty broad so that facilities could still be in compliant when they didn't have access to community level care. But that is really the link that connects us with these facilities, is that this specific standard says that incarcerated survivors should have access to confidential support services. And those confidential support services could be in-person, mail correspondence, hotline, or in-person services as well. So all of that really was what moved us to say, hey, we need to do something about it. So the state of Utah loses 5% of its federal prison budget each year for not complying with PREA. HB 95, this whole past year that we've been working on this, we have been working with Doug Fawson, who you'll meet a little later, and Rape Recovery Center and other programs so that they can support incarcerated survivors and that they come to compliance with this. Now, even though this is a Utah legislation, it doesn't mean that our state is in compliance. We're working towards it, but because they're continuing to choose to opt out of those audits, we technically are not in compliance in federal standards. But in Utah, we're trying to improve that. So as we kind of embark in understanding the work around serving incarcerated survivors, I always like to start with talking and sharing Joe. Joe is a survivor of sexual violence within detention, and really shares his story of how meaningful the services that, in this case, Jessica provided to him as he reported the incident that he experienced while incarcerated. And it's also important to know that the story of Joe was before PREA standards even were relevant, right? So there's been a lot of changes, and actually Joe has been a big influence in PREA standards and PREA compliance across the country. So I'll go ahead and start. And again, please practice self-care throughout this video.
There are quite a few different officers that an inmate has to check in with. And all those people, they all referred to me by my number. That advocate asked me what my name was. Because I'm not a thing. Because I'm a person with a name. And the first thing I told her was, my name's Joe.
Joe was one of the first clients I had, and I was brand new, like sexual assault advocate. Most of my communication with incarcerated survivors was through letters, and I would read, these words, and the feelings that they were expressing weren't all that different than any other survivor that I had worked with. The self-blame, the shame, the fear, the trauma, all of that stuff just was very similar to everyone else that I had worked with. The big difference being that, their resources were so limited, and their ability to self-soothe and their ability to seek out appropriate support was almost nothing.
I went to a psychologist. And my plan is that no matter what, am I going back into that cell? Psych says, okay, we'll get you moved. So I leave the psych, and here come the cops. And he comes up to me and he tells me, he says, all right, let's go. I said, where are we going? He said, back to your cell. Put me in waist chains and put me back in the cell. Nobody would let me out. I was on top of my bed. I was on the top bunk. He grabbed my ankle and he pulled me off the bed and proceeded to rape me. And the second night he raped me, and the third, and the fourth. Getting in contact with Jessica saved my life.
Some of the things that I would hear in the letters was just a lot of feeling isolated. With survivors who weren't incarcerated, they could just pick up the phone and call. We had a 24-hour crisis line. They could call whenever they, felt like it. But with the incarcerated survivors, their access to that communication was so limited. And so there was something really powerful and tangible about getting a letter, and you could see how hard they wrote or what their handwriting looked like. And then being able to write back, it was kind of this opportunity to be very thoughtful in a way that I couldn't have been on the phone. In an immediate crisis, I was able to really be very thoughtful in my responses.
Jessica was my advocate when I was assaulted. She was the person that said it wasn't my fault.
I meant it.
That was a turning point for me. As soon as she told me, I know you've been raped, I knew, without a doubt, and she could have never said another word to me. At that point, I knew that I hadn't done this. After the assault, I had been treated like a number. And she asked me my name, and she touched my hand as a human being. And it really made a difference. My name is Joe.
The story of Joe is, one I will always share about this work, because what we didn't have the opportunity to hear all of Joe's story. Had they been compliant with PREA, Joe is a member of the LGBTQ plus community, and he was in a cell with a sexual predator. So had they followed PREA compliance and had been able to follow those steps in intake to ensure the safety, right? As a member of the LGBTQ plus community, he would have not been put in a setting where he was housed with someone who had committed sexual violence to somebody else, and the reason why he was there. But you know, one of the things as we hear Joe's story is to really understand then what were some of those powerful services that Joe talked about that really helped him. What did Jessica provide as we think and reflect back on this video? Yes.
She named the crime that happened to him. She put words to it.
She named it 100%. She validated his experience, right? Anyone else?
Treated like him like a human being instead of a number.
Yep. Called him by his name. You know, it was a simple act, right? Anyone else?
Yeah, compassion,
Compassion.
and then just repeat the comments. If you could repeat the comments. For
For the owl. Okay. So we heard he was validated. We heard that he was, you know, called by his name and not just a number. Anyone else?
The letter.
The letter. Yep. Letter writing.
But it wasn't his fault.
That he heard it wasn't his fault. So as we think about Joe and the services that he received, does it differ from the services that we provide to victims who are not locked up, right? Who are in our community? Did it differ? Did it change? I'm hearing no's, seeing no's, right? It's the same services, maybe it's just in a different setting, right? But there were similar services to what we provide to folks that are in our communities who are not incarcerated. So as we think about and we learn more about detention, it could include prison, jails, lockups, fire camps, community confinement facilities, juvenile facilities, and immigration facilities. And in all those settings, we do find a lot of sexual violence happening within those settings. So every facility is, again, operated differently based on city, county, state, private corporations as well. So we hear a lot in the news a few years ago where we started to know more about these private facilities, right, that were sprouting up. And so companies like GEO will come to counties or come to cities or states and say, hey, I know that you can't afford to build up a new facility. We'll do it for you, pay us. And we'll, you know, create the facility, make sure we hire all the folks, but you also have to meet a quota, right? We also, you know, get paid for each inmate that's in there. And there's another video that I'll, you know, share with Rochelle so that you all can see it, that we really see that these for-profit prisons are really benefiting from human bodies because they get paid per human bodies and the stay that they're there. And so as we think about the world and incarceration, you know, we have to recognize that we are, the United States is the state that imprisons the most people, you know, compared to areas like China where the population is much higher than the US, right? So we have to recognize again that our state is, or our country really incarcerates a lot of people. And so women's incarceration has been increasing throughout the years. I've had opportunities to work in women's prisons, and a lot of the women that are there have experienced high level of violence that led to their incarceration or led to substance abuse, which then led to X, Y, and Z crime that led to, again, their incarceration. Right? We see compared to Utah to the United States, we're not that far behind, right? We are absolutely incarcerating women at higher rates than other places in the world. And then we look at incarceration based on ethnicity. Now, I want you to think of the predominant culture in our state and who is being overrepresented in our facilities. We have an overrepresentation of Black people in our facilities, we have an overrepresentation of American Indian or Alaskan Native and Hispanic communities, knowing the predominant culture in our state, right? So when we think about incarceration, we think about the work that we're doing, who is the system failing? Who is the system benefiting is what we need to think about when we're working in this work, right? So girls of color account for approximately 22% of the general youth population. But comprise approximately 66% of girls who are incarcerated. So there's again an overrepresentation of women, young women of color in our facilities. And so what is this, what does this look like in the day-to-day around structural violence? And when we think about structural violence, we have to recognize it's with rules, norms, or culture of an institution causes harm, right? So we see that in our communities, we see that again in our facilities, and that's kind of what this slide goes over. We have a structural violence of a code of silence, right? Well, in the community, the instruction is that we ignore violence. And then when we think a little bit further and deeper in it, who do we usually ignore, right? The most vulnerable, the most marginalized, right? Well, in the detention facilities, we see that as well, that violence is ignored, right? We hear a lot of facilities, and believe me, I've been to a lot of them, who say, nope, sexual violence doesn't happen here. That doesn't happen in our facilities, right? Because why? Because it's ignored, right? It's a code of silence that is happening within these insular systems that prevent victims from feeling safe to say, I have been sexually assaulted while in the facility or coming into the facility, I've experienced this type of violence. We see this structural violence in normalized violence. We dismiss it. Again, in the detention facility, it's dismissed. The example of Joe went to report, hey, I don't want to come back. This is what's happening to me. And they sent him back to the cellmate who was raping him, right? So then we see prejudice or racism, right? Where violence is seen as deserved. And we see that again in detention facilities. That same structural violence is happening in our facilities that is happening in our community. Well, if he didn't do this, then he wouldn't be here, right? And so if he was not here, then he wouldn't have been assaulted or raped, right? So we see that again as a form of violence is seen as deserved. We also see it in our rape culture, right? Where we say if someone goes to jail or prison, hey, don't drop the soap. Hey, it's an expectation, right? That sexual violence will happen. Well, as victim advocates who are interrupting violence all the time, right? How do we shift that, right? By saying, hey, it doesn't matter what you've done or what got you into this position. Rape is never okay, no matter who you are. And so then we see retaliation, survivors are punished, and we see that again in the detention facilities. If someone comes over to report, it is sometimes a life or death situation. Like, if I'm coming to report that I was raped, how am I going to be received when I come back? And I don't have the protection from, the facility here. And again, that isolation is heightened when we're in detention facilities because they literally cannot get out, right? They cannot get out of that situation. And so again, that is kind of the overall structural violence that we see in our community, which is the same in our detention facilities, except sometimes some of those are amplified. And so how do we see sexual assault behind bars? We have a similar picture, right, or infographic of this when we talk about victims of sexual violence and how many of folks report, how many folks actually go through the criminal justice process, and how many of those are actually found guilty, right? Similar infographic here with sexual assault victims in detention. But what the difference is that that little orange person in the corner are reports that were substantiated, which means maybe something happened. So they weren't found guilty, right? It's just saying may be something that that victim reported happened. So you see again that a lot of our survivors who are in incarcerated settings are not necessarily believed. So when we think about it, and this is a pretty difficult statistic to take in for those who work in the facilities and also for some of our victim advocates. Studies show that it is 50-50% that those that work in the facility are perpetrating, and that 50% of the cases, the other 50 are other inmates, but 50% is actual staff, whether it be doctors, law enforcement, volunteers that come in. It doesn't matter who, it's just whoever's considered staff in there are also perpetrating. And when we think about our youth facility, these numbers are higher. It's about 80% of the staff are doing the harm to our youth, okay? So these numbers really, again, show us the need for us to work with incarcerated survivors. So how do we see abuse by staff? We see the abuse of authority. We see sexual harassment, voyeurism, abusive searches, and sexual violence and rape. There's cases where, when you're incarcerated, you may have a release date, and there's a staff member who's abusing you and says, if you don't do what I say, I will impact your release date. And so the survivor, the incarcerated person, they want to get out. They're going to do whatever necessary to not. And who are they going to believe? Are they going to believe the incarcerated person, or are they going to believe the staff member, right? It is about power and control very much in these facilities. And then we see, again, a lot of reports from incarcerated folks of abusive searches. All of that PREA addresses, right? That the same sex person has to do the searches. So that's a way to prevent from sexual violence happening or sexual harassment. We see, again, a lot of calls of folks saying, when I get undressed, he looks at me, right? He's looking at me. Or when we're doing this, they're always looking at us. And it's not just a little glance, it's like a stare. They're just staring at me the entire time. And then we see abuse by other inmates. We see sexual harassment. We also see what we refer to as protective pairing and relationship abuse. And so this was an interesting point, because when I started working in this field with incarcerated survivors, we heard a lot of people call this some sort of domestic violence, where survivors were in, consenting relationships, and they were being abused, right? But when we got to speak to the survivors and talk to them about what was happening, it wasn't a consensual relationship. It was a survivorship, relationship that if I did not find somebody to protect me, then I would be at higher risk to be assaulted, right? So incarcerated survivors come in and they find the strongest person or the person who holds lead in those facilities, right, within the inmate population, and they seek for protection. They say, hey, I will do whatever you need me to do if you protect me, because I'm part of a vulnerable class, whatever it may be. Maybe this is the first time I'm in there. And so they become a husband and wife type of situation, right? But ultimately, that person who's in control decides how this relationship works. And so we saw a lot of cases where that protector would sell that person for, whatever, whatever, money for the commissary, whatever it would be. So that person would be sold to another inmate, to another staff member for commissary items, right? And they experience, again, high levels of sexual violence within their stay. So we not only address that was not domestic violence, that was actually exploitation, right? That we saw a lot of trafficking of people within these facilities, and of course, sexual exploitation. We see gang abuse, and of course, we see sexual abuse and rape. Now, they should not be having any type of sexual activity at all within the facility, but we know that it happens, and we also know that sexual violence is happening as well. So as we think about that and we shift over to this piece, I want you to think about who you think would be at higher level of target to be sexually assaulted behind bars. Members of the LGBTQ plus community, 100%.
Those with disabilities.
Those with disabilities are at very high rate of sexual violence. New inmates, yep.
Young inmates.
Younger inmates, youthful inmates, right?
Oh, sorry, I was gonna also
Elderly, yeah, elderly victims. Well, yep, sexual assault perpetrators, especially of children, yep. Anyone else? You all named a lot of them. The biggest and most, I feel absolutely outrageous is those with serious psychological distress are 9 times more likely to be sexually assaulted. So why do you think that is, though? Less likely to be believed, 100%, right? We had folks we had a case where a survivor said they keep coming in at night to rape me, right? They kept saying that and nobody believed them. Who's coming in at night? Who's coming in at night? Well, it was a staff who was coming in and raping them, and he was saying what was happening, but no one believed him. Scott, a survivor of sexual abuse in Illinois prison, says there's no therapy for rape victims in prison. The prison system is incompetent to handle the mentally ill and in face causes the mental illness that it should be treating. Desi, a transgender woman serving time at a men's prison who was in several sexually abusive protective pairings, says, the option for me are to choose up with a husband that's both strong enough and respected enough to protect me and with enough income to take care of me as his prison wife. Or I can be conscripted into a gang as a prison gang bitch and forced to have multiple sex partners who may or may not take care of me. So I tried to choose the lesser of 2 evils. I had an opportunity to meet Desi. Desi had a husband in prison, but when she came to this men's facility, she had already had top surgery, and he sold her to several men in the facility. She was the hot commodity in that facility because she had had top surgery. Now, Priya would have addressed that, right? Priya would have addressed that she's at high risk of violence. She should not have been housed in a male facility. In juvenile detention facilities, non-heterosexual youth are 7 times more likely to be sexually abused by other residents than straight youth. Troy, I didn't know my sexual orientation, but I knew that I was different. Soon after entering juvenile hall, one boy forced me to have oral sex with him in the shower area. He claimed that he would protect me from others, but he didn't. So how do we as victim advocates, as organizations, as just people, right? How do we address the bias that we are surrounded by with who is worthy of our services or who is the perfect survivor, right? And so there is fear of incarcerated people and the setting. When you walk into a facility, the loud clanging of the keys, the loud banging of the door when it opens, all of that, can be scary, right? I have been in the toughest, and scariest facilities, and I've never felt unsafe. But again, if you do, how are you addressing that, right? How are you addressing those biases and addressing why am I fearful? Why are these feelings coming up for me? And how do I navigate through them? We also see that a lot of that is influenced by the media, right? Of who is incarcerated and how incarcerated people act, right? And our own, in this movement, right, our own rigidity around who and the definition of who the victim is, right? Because you can be two things. You can be a perpetrator and you can also be a victim of violence, right? So it's a non-binary situation there, right? Like two things could happen at once. And so as victim advocates, it's our opportunity to continue to challenge ourselves and definition of who we think a victim is. And again, you know, this idea that because they're away, because they're behind bars, that we don't need to worry about them. But the reality is that they come back to our communities, right? And if they're in there, how do we help them, right, in that process of healing or, you know, of after victimization, and then hopefully impacting the recidivism that we're talking about earlier, right? That we don't that hopefully when they've healed and they've gotten that support, they know who the local program is, how to get to that victim advocate, how to get to those services to continue their healing. But again, we as a movement have to recognize that we have also built up a lot of these institutions, right? Like, and that we've not really thought about those that are experiencing sexual violence within these settings, and that many who are going into, like December talked about today, have experienced so much trauma that led to substance abuse, that led to maybe a life of crime, and now they're incarcerated and in this facility where it's so insular that they can't, they're also experiencing high levels of trauma in there. And so how do we address some of these concerns? You know, we've talked to a lot of programs throughout the state that are interested in serving incarcerated survivors. But we talk to them about those fears and those concerns. Have you visited a facility in your area? Have you toured it? You know, there's opportunities to volunteer. Have you, you know, volunteered there? You know, is your agency addressing some of those potential barriers to serving incarcerated survivors? Encouraging to do cross trainings, make sure that you know what the facility, how they train their volunteers, what are safety protocols when you go into the facility, and that you start developing really strong policies that help guide your work when you're embarking in this journey of serving incarcerated survivors. And when we think about what we can do, there are several things that we can do to help survivors. One of the ways that we can think about is, what are we doing now for survivors that are in our community? What services do we offer? How would we help this person? So as you think about her, and think about this question, how, if you got a call through the helpline, or they walked into the police station or your organization, and said, I've been raped, what services would you offer this person? Huh? You call December, love that. Yep, you call your victim advocate, right? Call your victim advocate so that we can get her some resources. What else? What resources may be available? A Code R exam? Protective orders? CVR? Anyone else in the chat? Support, yeah.
So we're talking about a sexual assault that happens inside of a correctional facility?
No, just a community member. Anyone else in the chat box? Counseling? Yes,
Talk to them about whether or not they would like to report.
if they would like to report, love that.
Give them their options.
Their options, right? I think we have this down, right? We know what to do when someone comes in, right? We know how to handle that. But then how does it change when we deal with someone who's incarcerated? Do we have the resources? Yes.
That's where I was, because I was like, I have questions about that.
Yeah.
So working in the prosecutor's office, we do and have had sexual assaults that happen in our facility with, I mean, we house state inmates here, we have long-term county inmates here, and as far as I know, because I do work crisis advocacy as well, we really don't get the opportunity to work with those clients because the correctional facility has its own, like the Department of Corrections has its own set of people that swoop in and do everything that they need to do crisis wise. And then as far as prosecution, they do allow me to give them their notifications, restitution, impact statements, things like that. Offer the counseling, CBR, things like that. But as far as crisis in our area, as far as I'm concerned, the Department of Justice kind of takes care of that on their own because they have their own team. Am I wrong?
So what's
Can you kind of paraphrase that back a little bit?
so I think the question is, being in the prosecutor's office, you could only do so much, right? But if somebody,
Crisis also, though.
so when
They
somebody
have to
reports, the correction department comes in and kind of handles it.
Yeah, they have their own team.
Yeah, so you'll meet Doug. He's the PREA coordinator for the state, specifically for the state facilities. And the state also contracts with local jails or, local lockups to hold inmates who are part of the state, facility. Doug is a PREA advocate, but he is not a privileged communicator like our community-based victim advocates. So there is a way to report, and that's what we are trying to change and say. But this standard says that they should have outside confidential services. So what county are you in? UNA. Okay, so we're not in UNA anymore, but ideally, if somebody's in a facility and reports, what they should be connected to is a local victim advocate like December, right? Who's a community-based victim advocate. And then December could go and say, hey, here are your resources. You can report if you'd like to the PREA coordinator, but that is a report to law enforcement essentially, right? It is not confidential. And so that's what we're navigating through currently with this PREA legislation, is helping the facilities understand that although they have a PREA advocate, it is not a confidential resource, right? And so when we think about this person, when we think about what resources we may have available, that's our challenge. Does our organization know what to do? We were really good at talking about our community member who is not incarcerated, right? But do we know what to do? Do we know what resources are available for this person? And if you're not, reach out to UCASA and we can help you connect with resources and or do some work at the state level to ensure that those areas know where to go and who to contact. And so as we think about it, the resources may differ a little bit of what a person who's incarcerated may have access to, but the overall support is the same, right? Like we talked about with Joe. So here are some ways that victim advocates can support those that are incarcerated. They can do that through crisis calls. Now we are working to ensure that calls to local community-based victim advocacy hotlines are free, non-recorded, confidential calls as the standard state. So if you're dealing with a crisis line, you treat calls from detention like any other calls as a crisis, right? Now there's a difference that you'll see is that as the picture showcases, they're open, right? They're open in the facility. So you may not get a full disclosure in the first call, right? It may take a while for that person to feel safe enough to tell you, and that there's nobody around them to be able to tell you that this is what happened. And so then what we do is, as advocates, we normalize the trauma, we offer and obtain as much as we can consent to follow up, right? And one of the things that we are working with with Doug at the state level is to say, if we cannot get in contact and they give us the permission to reach out to Doug in this case, right? We could say, hey, Doug, can you facilitate a conversation with this person without giving any information as to why, right? Which is right now what we have to work with incarcerated survivors, right? And so Doug is helping, make that happen. And so we also don't out the person. Doug knows the facility really well and will have a way to go in without outing that person that is seeking support from a victim advocacy group. Again, we are working towards this, but you may need it, when you're providing crisis support through a helpline, calls can be recorded and monitored. So remind the incarcerated survivor of that. The public spaces, sometimes they only have a short time to talk to you. And people may call and say, finally someone answers, finally someone cares. Here are my other concerns too, right? Addressing the hierarchy of needs. But again, your role is to say, this is what I can help you with, right? Let me get you resources to other services in the area. And again, challenge will obviously always be in those settings is confidentiality, the lack of disclosure, and that sometimes the needs are beyond your scope of work. I'm not going to go through the hotline scenarios, but you can have this PowerPoint so that you can go through it later. But you also can provide hospital accompaniments. And again, things to consider with hospital accompaniments is the location of the exam. Sometimes they're inside the facility, sometimes they take them out. You have to figure out with your SANE nurses where the exams are happening. How are you being notified if there's a HRT need for an incarcerated person? You also will have potentially corrections present there, right? How are you navigating that with confidentiality and knowing as well, the potential of staff members being the harm doer, right? The one that's causing the harm. So addressing confidentiality, many times they're in handcuffs throughout the exam. So you all who have worked with sexual assault victims know how invasive that forensic exam is and how hard it is. Now imagine being handcuffed the entire time. And understanding the accessibility of follow-up services. What is your organization able to do once you've responded out to this forensic exam? Again, always reminding corrections that this is a confidential space. Can you wait outside? Their thing is always going to be safety. I need to make sure I have view of the inmate. I need to make sure that the people around them are safe, right? So you may want to negotiate and say, well, you can be right outside, you have view of us, you can somewhat hear, and if I need help, I will scream, whatever it is to ensure some level of confidentiality for that incarcerated survivor. Here's another one that you can review. The other piece is written correspondence. As we heard from Joe and Jessica, right? That was their way of communication. One thing that we're working on is that we want our rape crisis programs that have that confidential, communication through that Confidentiality Act of Utah, that written mail to an incarcerated survivor be treated as privileged legal mail, that they have to open the mail, but they're not going to read it. They're not going to read it. They're not going to go through it. They're just going to open and move it on like they do with legal mail. So we are working on that so that communication is protected as well. And so again, you have confidentiality at different levels, but you're still not immune to mandated reporting. If they're a harm to others or to themselves, you're still responsible to report. And again, talking to your facility about who to go to, who you need to report to, is also part of that collaboration piece with the facilities. Accessibility and language, find out, what are the top 5 languages in the facility? What languages are you seeing in there so that you can offer services or ensure that you have that availability to talk to somebody who speaks their language, who can help you maybe write a letter in their language, right? That again, accessibility to and access is essential in this work. Consistency and timelines is huge. If you get a letter, respond back. Like I always think about, maybe give yourself a week to think about, what are the needs? How can I be really thoughtful and provide meaningful resources for someone who cannot leave, right? So thinking about that, give yourself a week, but set timelines and say, if I get a letter by a week, I'm responding, because they're waiting to hear a response from somebody. And provide appropriate referrals, make sure you're setting boundaries. Again, when they get that letter back from someone who actually cares, it is a lot for them. And so they may ask for things that are maybe crossing boundaries a little bit. Set it back and say, that's not my role. My role is to help you with this, Again, validate those feelings, focus on the survivor strengths, and establish those really clear boundaries. And, again, some of the challenges with that would be the detention staff opening mail, access to resources inside, boundary crossing, and services available to incarcerated at your agency. Like, find out what they are. Yes.
In the chat, sorry, it's going to be Alexandra Yost says the Rape Recovery Center has a full-time PREA specialist, Liz Laundrie, who is working with Doug at prisons and jails to launch a comprehensive system of confidential advocacy to survivors who are incarcerated.
Tell Alex she got a little ahead of herself because I was going to share.
Okay.
That was the big ending part.
I'm sorry.
No, I'm just kidding. Yes, all of that, right? So, as we think about this work and this movement to end violence, right? We are always looking towards that. We're, I am, always really honest that I don't want to work in this organization forever. I really want to work towards getting out of this job where we maybe are only focusing again on prevention, but not response, right? Because we are eliminating sexual violence. So this movement of ending violence for all, right, requires us to be, like Carla says, open-minded and open-hearted, that we cannot choose who's deserving of our services, right? That any survivor who has experienced any type of violence should have access to our services. And so long as some 200,000 people, like that infographic shared, are sexually violated in detention centers annually, rape will never really retreat into the realm of the unthinkable, no matter how many perpetrators we turn into victims, right? That in the height of the Me Too movement, there was an awesome article by Rodney, and Rodney shared that it was like the perpetrator had the key to my room, right? To my home, to come in at any time and rape me, because he was raped several times in detention, right? And so as we think about this, we must challenge ourselves that in order to end sexual violence, it must end in all levels and in all spaces in our communities. So one of, what I wanted to share is all of this work from with Representative Romero, with the Rape Crisis Center, Rape Recovery Center, has led to an additional legislation that focuses on PREA compliance with juvenile facilities. And that's where we're working on now. But this past year has led to the rape recovery, like Alex was saying, now having a PREA coordinator, now providing some sort of services in the facilities, working closely with the detention, with the correctional facilities, and with Doug, who's at the state level, who's doing amazing work to help us get into these facilities. It's not where we want to be, right? We want to be fully in there, but we are taking great steps to ensuring that survivors have access in these facilities. And it took advocates, right, and advocacy to get there. And so I just want to continue to encourage folks to really look at how your organization, how can you engage in serving incarcerated survivors and provide those very much needed services to them. So any questions, thoughts?
None in the chat, but I mean, I really want to thank you for doing this work. It's amazing, like how much good work is already being done, and then we think all these other victims that need to be served. And I think that's just sometimes where us as advocates, we need to not necessarily get defensive, but we just need to say there's more work, and so we need to unify to like go find some resources together. Sometimes say like, hey, this needs to be done. We believe in the cause. So what can we do to make sure that we can meet the need?
Yeah, organizations like Canyon Creek, like New Horizons, CAPSA, they're all, working with their facilities somehow, so we really want to encourage. I know the Refuge is really interested in doing this too. They have a lot of juvenile companies that hold youth, but the thing is that PREA really is our guiding standard that helps us, but we hope that one day Utah will say yes to audits and see how they're doing and be in true PREA compliance. But this is better than nothing. We're opening those doors.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being here. Nancy said helpful. So great. And our next presenter, you kind of briefly introduced Doug. Doug, as your